really want everybody to be thinking about today is that these symptoms are real, period, end of story. So there may be some variability in terms of how the symptoms show up, but the symptoms are very real and they are really frequently occurring during childhood and occurring in lots of different body systems. So we'll be talking specifically today about functional neurological symptoms, and we'll talk about some of that terminology. But these types of symptoms also pop up as kind of cardiac presentations with dizziness, syncope, kids who have POTS and dysautonomia in the gastrointestinal system, kids who have abdominal pain, IBS, chronic pain syndromes like headache, migraine, musculoskeletal pain, and then also through mental health diagnoses with the somatic symptom and related disorders. So if you have familiarity with maybe kids who have belly pain, you also then by default kind of also have some familiarity already with functional neurological symptoms. And we'll kind of talk about some of those shared systems. But again, these are physical symptoms that are popping up in the absence of a kind of co-occurring underlying disease or injury. They may be occurring after a disease or an injury, but they are not occurring kind of at the same time. So if we're really thinking about functional neurological symptom disorder specifically, this is also sometimes called functional neurological disorder. So the ICD-10 or the diagnostic manual that's used more frequently abroad calls it functional neurological disorder. The DSM or our psychological diagnosis manual here in the US calls it functional neurological symptom disorder. But so you may see it as FND or FNSD, and those are interchangeable. These are the kind of categories where typically we start to see symptoms popping up for kids with functional neurological symptoms. And essentially what it is these are all of the areas in which a person might experience changes in voluntary sensory or motor control. Now, what that means, it does not mean that the symptoms are voluntary. It means it's the parts of our bodies that are controlled by the parts of the brain that control voluntary muscles. So not breathing, and not kind of the basic systems that keep us alive, but can I move my elbow? Can I raise my arms? What my sensation is like. Sensation changes depending on like how cold you are, how warm you are, all different things. All of these sort of like sensory and motor experiences that are not part of the brain that keeps us alive, but part of the brain that we have some control over, like blinking, right? Blinking is a reflex, but you also can have a staring contest with somebody and choose to blink your eyes at different times. So the symptoms pop up. They can look like seizures. They can look like movement problems, like shaking, paralysis, difficulty walking. We've seen a huge increase here in kind of complicated motor tics in the last 4 or 5 years since 2020. Difficulties with thinking, so kind of brain fog. Loss of educational skill, so people that all of a sudden can't read, can't recognize letters. Dizziness, loss of consciousness, speech difficulties like stuttering or difficulty finding words, loss of vision, loss of hearing, kind of chronic pain syndromes, slowness, fatigue, difficulty with kind of activating, and changes in kind of touch sensation. You probably have seen kids with one of these. You probably have seen kids with multiple symptoms. One kind of like when you have one somatic symptom, you're then all of a sudden at risk for more of them. And you can imagine that, these patients have really kind of significant physical symptoms that often bring them into a medical center for diagnosis or for treatment. And it can be really confusing to present to a medical center with a very medical diagnosis. Imagine your child wakes up and cannot walk and then be told, nope, their brain is fine, their spine is fine, their legs are fine. This is a functional neurological symptom disorder. And the treatment for that is actually just to like return to normal, return to school, work on improving function, and often engaging with a provider who does cognitive behavioral therapy. But you can see how when patients present with these symptoms and then we say part of the treatment is actually to return to normal, there are often lots of barriers in how we actually get people back to normal. These symptoms are real, period, end of story. That is actually, if you are taking, I should have put that as an objective. If you are taking one thing away, we know that these symptoms are real. We know that they are not voluntary. We know that they are not due to anxiety alone. Anxiety makes these symptoms worse, but does not cause them in the first place. The old understanding of symptoms, so kind of pre-1970 or so, was the biomedical model, which was there was a disease or an injury and therefore there were symptoms. And if if a person was experiencing symptoms, let's say dizziness, and something wasn't wrong with their heart, then it was sort of like, oh, it's all in your head. It's just like a mental problem. And that was a really kind of problematic way to think about a human person's experience of their own body, because we actually, I mean, everybody can think of this. We know that that's not true. All of us have somatic symptoms. You might get a headache, or you might get, your belly might feel filled with butterflies when you're, doing, you have something important that you have to do. All of us may not have, symptom disorders, but everybody experiences somatic symptoms. And it's not typically necessarily just due to anxiety. So the biopsychosocial model gives us a much better way to think about this, which puts together biological factors. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. Biological factors, psychological factors, social and environmental factors. And so it helps us understand that symptoms are in fact due to a combination of how the brain processes information coming in and how it communicates it to the body. So the ways that we can think about functional neurological symptoms and kind of understanding it is a little bit like a fire alarm went off, the fire was put out, but the alarm is still going off, right? So a glitch in the alarm system, basically, that maybe there was an initial time where the person had shaky muscles due to a really hard sports practice, but then those shaky muscles are sticking around even once that sports practice is over. Again, alarm goes off, fire gets put out, but then the alarm keeps alarming. Another way to think about it is as a software problem, not a hardware problem. The body or the computer is healthy, but the software or the way that the computer is communicating is glitching. And then, of course, just as a glitch, right? So video games glitch all the time. Kids do a restart, everything is better. I always tell people you can't restart your body. So you have to sometimes engage in treatment to figure out how to do that restart. So those are kind of three nice ways to think about it. But again, these symptoms are very real. There's some biological research that proves that there are differences in brain structures and brain processes for kids who have functional neurological symptoms and for kids who don't. A lot of that involved in the emotion center and in autonomic responses that are responsible for our fight or flight response. Kids with functional neurological symptoms have kind of like basically an overactive fight or flight response. The brain responds to things as though they are dangerous even when they are not. Also, lots of psychosocial research. These kids are at higher risk for learning, attention, memory, and executive functioning problems. Now, I would pose the question, they are at higher risk, we know, but also I think sometimes maybe kids have pre-existing educational concerns. And sometimes that's one of the stressors that can make school attendance really challenging. So little food for thought for us to talk about a little bit later. There's variability in school engagement for these kids. I feel like I'm telling you things I already know, right? They're not going to school. They're missing out on a lot of those social and educational opportunities. They might be excluded because there's concern about liability. There might be peers or teachers who just don't understand and don't believe them. These kids tend to be maybe less flexible copers, which may be kind of one of the things that makes those symptoms more challenging as well. So let's talk about the biopsychosocial model. Again, visually, the biological, psychological, and social and environmental contexts interact to affect how we experience symptoms in our own body. So, for example, today, I love presenting, and it's one of my favorite activities, because I believe so strongly in the information that I want to share. And it's just like cool to meet people and cool to talk about functional neurological symptoms. So I really, really enjoy it. If somebody says, are you anxious about presenting? I would tell you I'm not. Nonetheless, my body would actually give me a different response, right? So my muscles feel a little bit tenser. Maybe my belly is a little bit uncertain right now. And part of that is because our brain is, again, taking in this information and taking in biological factors, how much sleep I got, how hydrated I am, how my brain processes information in the first place. I didn't get a lot of sleep because I have a sick kid at home, but and then like emotionally, how do I feel about presenting? What are my past experiences with presenting? And then the social environmental factors of, how are things in my office? Is it quiet? Do I like my setup behind me? How is everybody responding? I have no idea how everyone's responding because I'm paying attention to my slides and not the people, right? But all of these things you can imagine will play into how we interpret sensations in our own body. And so we really have to be thinking about, for these kids with functional neurological symptoms, how are they interpreting sensations within their own body? So if we just think basics about our best understanding of how and why functional neurological symptoms happen, it is that the brain and the body are communicate through the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is a little bit like the engine in a car in that it controls our speed. We have the sympathetic branch, which is like the body's gas pedal, driven by adrenaline, famous for the fight or flight response. And we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our relaxation response, the rest and digest response. Nobody's ever heard of that one, but it does exist. And that's actually, I always tell my patients, that's acetylcholine driven, but we never talk about that. We just talk about adrenaline. And so the brain spends all of its time, again, interpreting information coming at it from outside, putting it together with how do we feel on the inside, and then deciding, does this person need to hit the gas, get a little adrenaline boost, or hit the brakes and slow things down? Remember, the biological research tells us that kids with functional neurological symptoms and kids with somatic symptoms more broadly have brains that are more sensitive to perceived threat. So their brains are paying more attention to potential problems and sending too much adrenaline through the body. So that physiologically, these kids are getting a bigger physical response. And so the way that we understand functional neurological symptoms is that essentially their gas pedals are getting stuck for various different reasons. There are like 4 or 5 different models of functional neurological symptoms that could be their own presentation in terms of like the nuance between like why are their gas pedals getting stuck. But we know that the gas pedals are getting stuck so that these kids are in sort of this overactivated sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight all the time, and they kind of get used to it. And the brain is forgetting how to slow things down again. So the brain is forgetting how to hit the brakes. So essentially these kids are racing until they crash. That's their symptom, right? So maybe they are, having a non-epileptic seizure, and then that's kind of like the crash. Or maybe they're having leg paralysis, and that's kind of like the crash. And so essentially what happens is that the brain hits this threshold of sympathetic nervous system activity, different for every kid, different based upon all of those biopsychosocial factors. And when the brain says like, okay, enough is enough, symptoms are more likely to occur. And then it's a little bit like a feedback loop. Then we have the symptoms, right? They're very scary. They're scary for the kids. They're scary for the people around them, or they're just really like unexpected, debilitating, and impairing. And so symptoms happen, and then there's kind of that expectation of symptoms, and around and around and around we go. And then of course, we know that the treatment is to kind of get back to normal, that resting at home is actually not the way to manage these symptoms. So we know the treatment is to kind of get back to normal, but oftentimes the school setting may be a setting that has particular stressors that throw that nervous system over. Now, here's the deal. When we think about, I'm going to pop to this next slide. When we think about this idea of stress, if I just say to you, what are you stressed out about? All of you are going to kind of recode that in your brain. Oh, she's asking what I'm emotionally stressed out about, because that's kind of how we colloquially think about stress. But again, like I said, anxiety doesn't cause these symptoms, makes them worse, but doesn't cause them. And so we really have to take a more broad-based approach to understanding this idea of a stressor and think about biologically, what are the stressors? Not sleeping well, not eating well, not being well hydrated, the physiological demand of like sitting in school all day in those chairs, going from class to class to class, the attentional demands of that. And then you throw on top, right, any kinds of extracurriculars. Just biologically, these kids, again, most of whom are getting diagnosed during the adolescent years, are under an extraordinary amount of stress just from a physical perspective. And throw on, of course, all the rest of the emotional and environmental things that can kind of occur during adolescence, those psychosocial factors as well. But we can kind of make the case for functional neurological symptoms happening just based upon some of those biological stressors. And again, for these kids who are maybe not super flexible copers, they are typically go, 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 go at baseline until they crash. And then the crash is kind of their body's way of saying, like, this has actually been enough. So these functional neurological symptoms are due to that sympathetic nervous system getting overactivated by various different stressors or by those health habits getting really out of sorts. And also somewhat due to kind of how the person feels those sensations, what their beliefs are about those sensations. And all of that kind of contributes to that sympathetic nervous system being activated, kind of getting stuck. And then the symptoms are sort of like the crash. And so functional neurological symptoms means that symptoms are due to how the nervous system is functioning, not something dangerous in the body. We know something is wrong with how the brain and the body are talking, but not actually something wrong with the body part in which the symptoms are happening or with the brain. So we know the body's healthy and the symptoms are real and they're involuntary. They are due to an overactivated nervous system. So that's that like biological explanation that I think like candidly a lot of patients don't necessarily get. They're just told like, oh, you're just, it's just due to stress and like get back to school. But it's actually much more nuanced. And there are those biological, psychological, and social and environmental factors that we want to be paying attention to when we're figuring out how do we get kids back to school. So the goal of intervention always is to improve function, get back to school, right? Get back to your life and learn how to re-regulate the nervous system. So cognitive behavioral therapy is sort of like our best possible way to do that. And that kind of breaks down some of the barriers to successfully getting back to school. But we also need like a really good school plan. And if we look at the data that comes out of the pain literature, function has to improve before pain does. So that's really the core of why we say we have to get kids back to school, is because we need to get them back to doing the things that they need to do and that they want to do, while also learning how to hit the brakes on their body. Because again, when you toss kids back into school, as you all know, it's not always necessarily successful. So we're going to see if I can give you some hot tips on how to make it a little bit more successful. Okay, so wild copyright violation here, but I have tried to pull this all together into our car metaphor. I have little ones at home, so we've been watching Cars a lot. So we are going to be talking about functional neurological disorder from the standpoint, from the Piston Cup racing series. And I'm feeling really proud of myself. I embedded some videos in here, which we're just, Debbie and I tested them out, so we're going to really hope that they work. So we're just going to watch a little 2-minute clip on what I imagine the FND experience is like for our patients and students.
Okay, here we go. Here we go. How do I do this? Come on.
I'm going to pause. Can everyone hear? I hope.
And yes.
Okay,
Come
awesome.
on, baby.
Mr. McQueen.
Cruz, thank you for the old man training, as crazy as it was, but I'm warmed up enough, and now I need you to launch this thing.
Mr. McQueen, wait until you can handle it, please. There are no shortcuts.
Okay, we'll just see about that.
All right, my star racer is on the simulator.
Why, yes, I am.
Well, let's see you take it out for a spin.
Right away, Mr. Sterling. Owner of the company.
Okay, have fun.
This is what I'm talking about. Whoa, didn't know about those.
Prepare to race.
Wait, what did it say? Is it
The
talking?
green flag is
I don't
out.
see the flag. What do I do?
Go.
Go?
Go.
Oh, that's sensitive.
You have hit a wall.
Shouldn't be this hard, should it?
You have hit a wall.
You're fighting the simulator. Just race like you always do.
You have hit a wall.
There can't be this many walls on a regular track.
You have been passed by Jackson Storm.
Wait, Storm's in here?
For motivation. Storm races at 2:07. Pick it up, Mr. McQueen.
I'm trying.
You have hit a wall.
Mr. McQueen, come down from there and we'll work you up to this.
I am fine, Cruz. I can do it, okay? Whoa, 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 whoa!
You have jumped a barrier.
Ah, sorry.
You have maimed 2 vehicles. You have destroyed a drinking fountain. You have disabled an ambulance. You are on fire. Danger. Danger. You are going the wrong way.
Look out, look out! Turn it off, turn it off! Get these things off of me!
You have crashed. You have crashed.
Are you all right?
You have crashed.
I've crashed.
Oh, all right. Hang on, let me pause that. Okay, we don't need the ads afterwards. So you can sort of think about this idea of, right? Like, I just love this clip because I think it's, the owner of the company is watching, right? We've got people watching, expecting performance. And, like a lot of kids who end up getting FND, right? Lightning McQueen is a really talented racer, and there's lots of expectations about his performance. And so kids end up just kind of going. And again, Lightning McQueen's realizing like, ooh, this is not going the way that I thought it was, but kind of can't pivot. And so a lot of the things we're going to talk about are how do we support kids with FND in pivoting and kind of hitting the brakes and going a little bit more slowly. All right, so there we go. So it's all about how do we get back in the race? How do we get back to typical functioning? So school attendance and engagement. And sometimes we actually just have to start with attendance before we get to engagement. We're going to call attendance a win sometimes, even if kids are not fully engaged. So I want us to be thinking about how do we get a car back in a race after a crash, and how do we keep the car from crashing again? Our job as the grown-ups or the pit crew is to help with setting up a reasonable race plan and a reasonable pace. But we really have to be thinking about, for kids with FND, there are an extraordinary number, well, for all kids, an extraordinary number of factors that go into their day-to-day performance at school. And so I always think about this, I use a car metaphor all the time when I'm talking to kids with FND, and I talk about the fact of like, cars have speedometers. We know how fast they're going. Cars have dashboards to give us indicators all the time of like, how much gas do we have left? What's our engine health like? What's our air pressure? Like, we get all of these kinds of indicators on our cars. We don't get any of those indicators on our bodies, right? So, and in addition to that, you can't push past an empty gas tank. But you can push past hunger. You can push past muscle soreness. You can push past feeling really exhausted after 2 tests in a row. Humans can push past all that stuff. Cars can't. And so, how nice it would be if we had all of those indicators. But you can really start to think about all of the demands that middle school and high school have for kids and how much these kids have to kind of manage in a school setting. And again, typically during adolescence, sleep isn't great. Kids have to get up really early for school. They're sleeping as late as humanly possible. They're usually skipping breakfast. Maybe they're allowed to carry water bottles at their school. Maybe they're not, because that one kid brought something that wasn't water that one time. Maybe they can't refill their water bottle because it's just it's just water, fountain water, and it tastes bad. Maybe they don't want to go to the bathroom at school because everybody's vaping in the bathroom, right? Even some of these basic health habits, right? Maybe their lunch is at 10 a.m. Even some of these basic health habits and basic kind of like car maintenance sometimes it's hard to pull off during the school day. And then we think about what's the race like, right? So if we're getting a kid back in a race, right? If we're getting a car back in a race, what's the roadway like? Like, is the road in good shape? Are there obstacles? Are there detours? How much is being demanded of these cars? Are they having race days? What kind of race, right? Is this, Lightning McQueen is like a race car, but what if we're putting Lightning McQueen on an off-road track? I actually think he doesn't do well in that, if I'm remembering correctly. So this idea of like when we're getting students back to school, either after FND diagnosis or after FND flare or whatever it is, we actually have to be thinking about, number one, how good are they doing with taking care of themselves? And how can we flex the school setting to be able to allow them a little bit more flex there? And what can we do to help them start to slow down enough so that they can move around those obstacles, so that they can handle the detours, so that they can slow their bodies down enough so that they start to recognize some of those signals of like, wow, I'm really feeling tired, I need to take a break. And then environmentally, how can we set up an audience and spectators that allow people to take a break, and how can we be supportive from the grown-up perspective? So it's really all about how are we gathering all those parts of that crashed car together? How are we helping rehab the car, get it back together, get it back in the race, but kind of slow and steady? Because what we don't want is for, kids like work really hard to kind of get all their pieces back together, get back in the race, and then have another crash. And I have patients that are like, yeah, I feel like I'm sort of like carrying my door on one side and like I've got tires on my back and I'm just trying to hold it all together. Middle school and high school students don't often have enough time or space to be able to really kind of like heal to get back. And we, the really tough thing is we can't give kids 2 months off, because then what ends up happening actually sometimes is they get worse. And so it's this really hard, I think the metaphor is like you're flying, putting the plane together as you're flying it, which I know is not a car metaphor, it's a plane metaphor, but really figuring out how can we offer support in the school environment so that kids can do the best that they can to get back in the race. The other piece to it is there's a huge amount of very normal anticipatory anxiety. We only need one trial to learn something is dangerous, just one, right? So we only need one trial to have symptoms at school. And then all of a sudden that classroom or that room or that hallway, the brain very appropriately is already amping up that nervous system to prepare for it happening again. So I always use this super silly example in my office, where I've worked here for about 14 years. If I come in tomorrow and a bucket of water falls on my head, I will forget the 14 years where no buckets of water have fallen on my head, and I will only remember the bucket of water that fell on my head. I will be on high alert for buckets of water the next day that I come into my office. And if it happens again after that, I certainly will start thinking like, ooh, maybe this is like not an office that I want to work in anymore. Again, one trial takes away the 14 years of no buckets of water over my head. The other way you can think about it is like, if you've ever eaten a food that's made you sick. I ate split pea soup when I was in high school. I threw it up everywhere. I have not eaten it since then. If I think about eating split pea soup, just think about it. That one time, my belly hurts. And so that tells my brain split pea soup is not safe. Now, that's fine for me to avoid split pea soup because there's lots of other soups out there. But if that's a response my body is having in math class, I can't very well avoid math class. So again, the brain only needs this one trial learning. So we have this very normal anticipatory anxiety coming back into a situation where symptoms have happened before, or even the idea of like, if symptoms happened, it would be embarrassing. Like maybe it didn't happen at school, but maybe what if it does happen at school? And that sympathetic nervous system gets ramped up, and that makes those symptoms more likely to occur. So the pit crew, right? How can we hit the mark on validating symptoms? We know that these symptoms are real. We know you're not doing them on purpose. We know you're not doing them for attention. We know you're not faking them. And also encourage active coping. The symptoms are real even if you can't see them. You all can think about times where you have had symptoms and nobody can see them. That doesn't make them less real. The really hard thing about somatic symptoms and functional neurological symptoms specifically is like we don't have a way to measure our nervous system functioning. We don't have a test that shows, yeah, your nervous system is really over responsive. Oftentimes, the stereotype is that kids are getting a stomach ache in the classes that they don't enjoy, and they are trying to get out of those classes by going to the nurse's office. This is a pattern that happens where the grown-ups involved in like helping a kid with FND might notice like, oh, this is always happening in math class, or it's always happening in between classes, or whatever it is. The reason that happens is, so if you take a kid who is more likely to have symptoms in math class, the reason for that is when the brain is engaged in something enjoyable and pleasant, it is not paying attention to the body. When the brain is disengaged, it defaults back to paying attention to the body. So that you can think about, if you love your English class, you're going to be able to engage in that. Your brain is not going to be paying attention to your body, and your nervous system is going to calm a little bit. You're going to be less likely to have symptoms. But if you're in a class where it's kind of hard, or the teacher definitely doesn't seem like they're going to let you take a break, nervous system is going to be paying more attention to the body. Symptoms are going to be more noticeable, and they're going to be more likely to occur. Even if you see the pattern from a grown-up perspective, kids are not faking their symptoms to get out of class. Those symptoms are happening more in the classes that are hard or boring, or the teacher is less flexible, because the brain is recognizing that on a sympathetic nervous system level and kind of preparing for the potential for symptoms. So I am not going to, I will say, like, as we're getting into like, how do we help these kids in school? I'm not going to be able to give the perfect school plan for every kid. I am going to try and I'm going to try and throw lots of things out. And this will always come back to, what are people picking and choosing that seems to make the most sense for each kid specifically. So if we're talking about getting back to school after diagnosis or after a flare, right, it might have to come at like a slow exposure, right? First, can we get kids in the parking lot? Again, we want them to have an experience where their nervous system is not overloaded, little bit at a time. So again, in that video at the beginning, Lightning McQueen wasn't listening to the like, hey, why don't you slow down? He was just like, I got this. I'm going to like jump right back in again, right? We as adults may have to say, okay, we're going to come up with this plan, and this is what we're going to stick to. We believe you can do it. Here are the things that help us know that. It might be hard, and we're kind of here to problem solve it. So it might be, first we're in the school parking lot, then we're in the building, not going to any classes, just sitting in someone's office. Then maybe we attend a class. Then maybe we attend 2 classes. How quickly this progresses depends kid to kid. And I always think about, like, if we're getting to, attending a half a day and symptoms are getting worse, then like, again, that gives the opportunity to problem solve. Do we need to back down a little bit to give that nervous system a bit more time to get adjusted? It is super important to allow these kids to participate in things they enjoy. Lots of kids love learning. Some kids really love school, but it is also like, if we can get them back to school by getting them back to the things that they enjoy, and school kind of comes second, we're still winning. So I do think it's super important that kids be allowed to participate in that extracurricular stuff. So basic heart maintenance. Teens are supposed to get 8 to 10 hours of sleep, and not take naps. Again, this is just a really big problem for teenagers. Sometimes people feel like a late start, or a study hall first period helps ease transition back. Again, kid to kid, right? Kind of figuring out what is the pace of their day look like, and are there ways, and again, some of these things, candidly, are also things that a kid might be working on with a therapist or a medical provider. So not all of this is things that like teachers have to be doing. I just wanted to give the like broad based of what are some of the things that are we should be thinking about. We want to give these kids access to snacks, particularly mid-morning. Lots of them are skipping breakfast or feeling nauseated in the morning. So really kind of making sure that there's room in the schedule for them to get food about, I would say within like 1 hour of waking up and then about every 2 to 3 hours after. Hydration is so important. When we're well hydrated, the body just has to work less hard. Again, we want kids to have unlimited access to water, unlimited access to the bathroom, and like, please, to the degree that we can, ask teachers in the school setting to stop offering extra credit for not using bathroom passes. So kids just like need to be able to go to the bathroom, even if they're going to the bathroom for 5 minutes to just get a little restart. And then like 1 hour of exercise daily, I have a star next to that because that can certainly be like a little challenging to pull off, particularly if kids have weakness or paralysis in the legs. So I want to talk a little bit about that recommendation for exercise next. That comes into pacing. So again, kids are going 100 miles an hour at the time that they get diagnosed and kind of if symptoms are being maintained. The adults have to provide the pacing. We have to start kind of thinking about how are we putting up stop signs and how are we putting up guardrails to help kids start to slow down. They are going so fast, they're missing the signals. And so planned breaks and accommodations for more frequent breaks during the day can go really far. I always tell kids, listen, like you can't always predict when your symptoms are going to happen. And you don't always necessarily get the signal because again, the body's used to going so fast. It's hard to hear all the noise. So that if we do planned breaks, number one, you get a little bit of an idea of like, oh, what does it feel like to be a little bit more relaxed and kind of hit the brake? And number two, over time, that helps re-regulate the nervous system so that we're less likely to hit that threshold. Thinking through the student's schedule, right? Is there a study hall in there? Are all the academic classes in the morning and are some of the elective classes in the afternoon, right? What does the pace of the schedule look like? Can we give more time in between classes? Number one, so people get a brain break. Number two, so they're not trying to navigate with their symptoms in a really crowded, busy hallway, right? Can the kid either leave early or get to the next class late? So there's less of that chaos. Imagine you are super, super physically elevated and you're trying to navigate a school hallway. Can we have use of the elevator, right? So again, big picture, do we want kids getting back to normal and kind of not using any assistive devices? Sure. But if using the elevator helps the kids spend more time in the school building, then we're winning. So that doesn't necessarily have to be a forever accommodation, but in the short term can be super helpful. And then always self-pacing for gym, for sports, for activities. I want kids to be empowered, independently empowered to say, I need a break. And so that means teachers need to be flexible to say like, yeah, sure. Like you could sit on the sidelines and do some stretches instead of running back and forth in basketball. Again, does this have to be this way forever? No. But in the short term, if kids feel like they have more independence, the brain learns, oh, wait a minute, I can learn to control my body. And there's some really nice brain-based research that goes along with that the more kids feel like they have something they can control, the less likely they are to have those symptoms. Okay, we have another video.
The green flag is out and we're back to racing.
And I should like give some context to this. I forgot to do that. This is kind of this idea of like, how is a kid managing symptoms in the school setting?
Cruz, what are you doing? Come on, pick it up. You gotta go faster. Okay, call her Frances Beltline and tell her the school bus of death is after her. What? No, trust me.
Frances Beltline? The school bus of death is after you.
What? Oh, right.
Okay, that was different. Cruz, you're looking too tight now. Come on, loosen up.
Tell her she's a fluffy cloud.
What? No.
Smokey, tell her.
Cruz, you are a fluffy cloud.
Oh, right. Too tight. I'm a fluffy cloud. I'm a fluffy cloud.
Anticipate your turns. Cruz, get your head in the race.
No, wait. Tell her she's on a beach and all the little crabbies have gone night-night.
No, I ain't saying that. You tell her.
All right, Cruz, the beach. I need you to think of the beach.
Mr. McQueen?
Yeah, it's me. Remember the beach.
Oh, pick a line. Stick to it. Got it.
All right, not too bad.
This is nothing like the simulator.
You got every tool you need.
Now remember Thomasville.
Thomasville?
Yeah, sneak through the window.
Now that, I understand.
Sneak through the window.
So I love that clip because what that does, right, it shows somebody back in the race getting the support and having somebody say like, hey, what about this? What about this? Don't forget this. And so I just think it's a cute clip that really like illustrates how we can provide some support. So again, like I said before that video, we really want to be encouraging independence in coping. So the newest data on functional neurological symptoms coming out of Aaron Fobian's lab down at University of Alabama in Birmingham is that if we can give kids independence, so instead of having a whole bunch of grownups that are doing all the work, saying, okay, we're here to support you, and you need to kind of take these steps forward. We've kind of created this plan, but you need to take the steps forward I really like this idea of kind of having some in classroom coping. So what can the kid do while they are sitting in class? If that's not working, what are the out of class activities and where is that location going to be? Is it going to be an empty classroom? Is it going to be a resource room? Is it going to be a therapy room? Whatever the school has on hand. And making sure there are also some kind of distraction and relaxation opportunities there. And then third step is asking for help from a trusted adult. And the goal is always, how do we stay in the school building and get back to class? So the goal should never be symptoms are too bad, we're going home. So we want to kind of think through, how do we create a supportive environment so that, again, the kid learns that like school is a safe place and there are people that can help there. And when we allow kids to go home, the message that sends is, we don't think you can do this. And it sends a message to the brain of, we don't think you can do this. And so what we want to be doing is saying like, hey, you're safe. I know this is really hard. We have our coping plan in place and we're going to practice it. And again, symptoms sometimes get a little bit worse upon return to school before they get better, that extinction burst, but they do often get better. High intensity situations like tests, standardized exams, even if kids did not have this prior to having symptoms, while they have symptoms, again, that nervous system is really up here all the time. It's perfectly reasonable to give some extended time to have kids take tests in a quiet room. Again, we want to aim for like function in school, but also success. Also some reminders of like, hey, you can do this. And we're, there's an accommodation plan to support you. Also kind of thinking about like, if there's been a lot of missed school, modifying assignments and really just, having the focus being on, instead of getting caught up, but the focus on sort of staying caught up. You might need to put some limits in place. I find that most of the time kids are not taking advantage of the system. I know sometimes, it can feel that way, but really when we look at data, like kids are not faking their symptoms and they're not faking their distress. Maybe sometimes it could seem that way, but truly, this is a really involuntary response on the part of the nervous system. And sometimes we do need to get like a little creative and a little clever to figure out how to get kids' nervous systems to deactivate in the school setting. But I think it's it's pretty reasonable to give lots of accommodations, again, so that kids perceive that there's support there. From that standpoint, social support, making sure kids have the opportunity to connect with friends, really addressing unsupportive peers and teachers. I will tell you, my patients like pretty consistently report that there are teachers who don't follow their 504 plan, who embarrass them, who say you're fine, who say they're just faking. And that just like we all can do all of this work trying to get kids transition back into school, and that actually completely dissolves all of our work. So I think it is really important to make sure that there's education for the schools, and figuring out again, like, who is the contact person that can really carry forward when kids are discharged from the hospital, or when they're back in their homeschool setting, that can really make sure that teachers understand the importance of supporting these kids, and coaching students of what do they want to say to their peers. The best thing is to kind of be honest and keep it short. I have FND. Sometimes my brain and body aren't communicating, and I have these symptoms. Versus it's private, or I don't want to talk about it, because again, that often sort of like increases students kind of being curious about it. Friends as helpers during symptoms, this goes 50-50. There are a couple things in this presentation that I put question marks next to, because it actually really depends student to student. This is not necessarily a recommendation I would make as a blanket, but for kids who it helps them to have some social support and it helps them manage, there's no harm as long as the peer is not being asked to do something that is causing them any distress or is not age appropriate. From that standpoint, communication, who's the point person? Who are we communicating with? Do they understand? Do they feel competent to kind of share with other parts of the pit crew? And is the student being supported in terms of communication with adults? So are we asking a student to do too much advocacy for themselves in a high intensity situation? And what can we do to kind of pave that a little bit so that the student doesn't have to do all the work? A consistent message and response is really, really important, and that includes the parents. So Debbie had asked a great question. We kind of were chatting about this of like, well, what do we do if the parents are going, totally in the other direction? And I think in that standpoint, like, some of that is circling back to whoever the diagnosing team is and making sure that the parents understand how important it is to support function. And then if the patient's being seen on the outpatient side by a psychologist or a therapist, also making sure that that person is looped in as well. And I think like the best we can do is kind of consistently try and give that message. And, improving function is really important. Are there some families that still kind of don't buy the diagnosis and have a really hard time with that? Yeah. And that is often super challenging because the parents are having a hard time tolerating the kids' distress. And so that makes it hard for parents to follow through, which makes it more challenging to get kids kind of back to typical functioning. It's overall not recommended to call 911, not recommended to have the squad come. There's not really like an acute response that can happen in the emergency room that can help these kinds of symptoms, and not recommended to monitor vitals. Now, I put a star there. Those are our recommendations typically, but if the kid has maybe epilepsy and non-epileptic seizures, then that child's medical team might have other recommendations. And so I do think, again, that coordination and communication with the medical team and the treating team to make sure that the school's concerns are addressed and that symptoms are clarified. And, is the medical team able to say, like, we do not need you to call the squad and it is not medically indicated? And is that enough to satisfy schools? Not recommended to have a one-on-one aid. It's not recommended to empty the classroom. We kind of want to minimize attention without being dismissive. Allow the student to sit in the back of the classroom near the door so they're not right in the middle if they do have symptoms. And then use of mobility aids is really tricky. So There's often a question of do we, if a child's having leg paralysis, do we just put them in a wheelchair so that they're at least at school? And I recently was talking to a physical therapist, and we were going back and forth, and it was sort of like, would we rather have the patient at school and engaged than sitting at home? And like we said yes. And so anybody who is using mobility aids, we want to make sure that that comes along with a physical therapy referral, and that there is always, always, always a plan to reduce usage, so that maybe the wheelchair is only being used for long distances and not short distances, right? So that should always come along with somebody working with a physical therapist.
Rocco, just letting you know you have about 5 minutes left.
I know I think this is my last slide. Yes. Okay. So, and this is probably the one people are going to have the most questions on. So like, what if we can't even get the kids in the door? I will say candidly, I don't feel like there's an easy answer for this above and beyond that school transition plan. Sometimes the kids that we can't even get in the door of the school building because their symptoms are so impairing even before, I think sometimes we have to approach it from like a school avoidance framework and maybe make sure we're assessing, is there comorbid anxiety? Was there school avoidance before symptoms started? Has this, shown up in other ways during their educational career? Are we missing out on something from a learning perspective? So is there an undiagnosed learning concern? And that question of like, is virtual school ever appropriate? The easy or the simple answer is no. Like, we always want the kids in their typical school programming. But if a kid is really debilitated, then I think there's a bigger question of how do we do something rather than nothing. And again, this could be an entire presentation of how we, for kids who are really, really struggling. I never want to pick virtual school. But sometimes I think that some sort of a hybrid program is better than nothing, right? So we certainly don't want them sitting at home. And so how can we kind of approach it from that kind of more that school avoidance framework and make sure that we're not missing other things that can make school more challenging. There's a summary slide to kind of talk a little bit about what are all of the ways that these strategies improve things. Those are my favorite 2 resources for school. And I am happy to answer questions in 3 minutes. I meant to leave more time for questions. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries. We have a few. The first one is, do you find high achieving students have a greater propensity to FND?
Yes, I do. Now we don't know why, but absolutely, right? So the kids that are more likely to get the diagnosis, totally anecdotally, it has not shown up in the research, but anecdotally, really high achieving kids who are kind of like doing all the things do often land in my office. Yes.
Another one is, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I just said we haven't figured out the exact mechanism, but yes.
They're wondering if someone could speak how long FND can last. Is this a lifelong challenge or an acute event?
It can be both, right? So it depends. So sometimes kids have one episode and never have another. Sometimes kids have longer lasting symptoms. And typically kids get better faster the less time they've spent with the symptoms, and the better the intervention is, and the better the explanation is. Most of the time kids get better, most of the time, with treatment. And as long as they kind of learn how to regulate their nervous systems, typically they don't have ongoing symptoms.
Great. The next question I think is appropriate with what you have up on the screen, but what handouts do you give out to schools to help them educate on FND?
The handouts from those 2 websites. Those are both science-based and accurate. So those would be the 2 that I would direct people to.
Perfect. And then we had 2 people just chime in, and I think everyone on this call has probably had the same experience with whenever you have a child with non-epileptic seizures. It is protocol for many school districts, and a lot of it is based upon state or county to have a policy that they do have to call 911, again, from a liability standpoint. Any thoughts on that, even if you have a health plan or anything like that, in your experience where you were able to change that piece?
Yeah, I think that that's really, really challenging. So, oftentimes, where we have been able to make change there, and number one, that's coming out of a lack of understanding of non-epileptic seizures and a lack of understanding of functional neurological disorders, right? That is that very, kind of biomedical approach. We have had the most success with that, with having co-signed letters with like the psychologists and the neurologists that are saying, or those psychologists and the cardiologists that are saying, like, that the squad does not need to be called. So we've been able to move the needle on that a little bit, but I mean, I have made no impact at like a state level. And so I don't know if perhaps Ohio's rules are different than other rules, or if there is variability from school district to school district, but it is certainly super challenging. And so from that standpoint, I often also talk about with patients that like we need to work really hard to kind of get your nervous system regulated and hit the brakes prior to those symptoms occurring, so that we don't even get to the point that they're occurring. And so sometimes that can be super motivating, because lots of times that the squad getting called is really anxiety provoking and can really actually, I mean, it candidly like worsens symptoms. And so I think that having that be a motivator for the kid of, okay, let's see what happens if we do a break once every 10 minutes in your class, or once every 10 minutes in your classes. And let's see if that kind of helps things. But I have had the most success clinically with a strongly written letter that's co-signed by the medical provider and the mental health provider.
So much. This has been extremely helpful. In the comments, everyone's saying awesome presentation, very informative and so forth. Just
Thank
a
you.
reminder to everyone that this presentation is recorded and will be on the HEAL website under Ed Chats. You do have to sign in order to access that. So if you have any questions, be sure to email our info@healassociation.org. And then I can get that to Dr. Zaka and make sure I get the questions to you. So yes. I just want to thank everyone for being here. And I really appreciate the participation. I also want to remind everyone that we are currently also trying to get individuals together to be a part of our 2026 conference presentation committee, where you would be reviewing all of the presentations and pick the ones that you think would best suit our members' needs at the upcoming conference. So please, again, email info@healassociation.org if you are interested in being a part of that committee. We welcome all of you to be involved in some capacity. So we appreciate Dr. Zaka and all of you participating. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.